Three, two. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, as opposed to good evening. You're very welcome to a very special edition of Words on Whiskey, episode 13, and certainly lucky for some. So I hope you're all sitting down and have your samples and are set to enjoy what promises to be a very, very special show. We're joined by two people that I hugely admire in the industry. We've got Chris Hennessy, who's been a fantastic ambassador for Irish whiskey. He's working at the Dillon Bar in Kilkenny, and his knowledge of whiskey history and spirit history is second to none, I would say. Except perhaps when it comes to whiskey, we also have Garland, who is brand ambassador for Irish distillers, and under that umbrella, of course, comes Redbreast, which we're going to be enjoying today. So I'm not going to spend too long. I'm hoping we have people in here now at the moment. So I'm just checking the show. If you're on, can you just say hello? Okay, everybody must be on the Facebook side, so just give everybody a few minutes. Okay, so if you don't mind, we'll just take a couple of minutes for people to come into the room, and I can see people. There's Matt Kelly now, Dempster. Thank you very much for joining us. You're very welcome. And hopefully you're picking us up okay. Ronan, how are you? Shane, excellent. Hi, Tim. Wednesday, Michael. Hi, all. Okay, I think the best way to introduce this really is firstly to allow the person whose brainchild this was, which is Chris, introduce and tell us about this. So, Chris, go ahead.
So the purpose of the tasting is there is a lot of bottles out there that you'll find on auction sites, and there's a lot of bottles out there that people will see as prizes. And realistically speaking, they're in-depth looks at our history. So one of the first bottles we'll be tasting is from the late 1960s, early 1970s, and it's something that I've come across on dozens of occasions, sitting on back bars, sitting in cabinets, and they're prized possessions. For lack of a better word, they're dust gatherers because the seals are rarely ever cracked. This liquid is rarely ever experienced. And when you sit down to a Redbreast 12-year-old these days, it tastes absolutely beautiful. And you're told that over time, the sherry casks have evolved. Over time, the brand has evolved. It's gone through different distilleries from Bow Street itself to the present day Middleton. And you kind of get to the point where you wonder if it's evolved, how? If it's changed a little bit, how? Where the flavors come from. So the purpose of the tasting is to show you from the late 1950s where distillation straight through to today, how they've evolved, how they've changed, what way they have adapted, and how the technology has influenced the taste themselves. And the only way to realistically do that is literally side by side. So spent from last September straight through till now sourcing different bottles, specifically from different eras, to showcase the different decades of Redbreast itself and the different decades of ownership, cask usage, and then technology changes itself.
Excellent. And there is a charity side to this as well, Chris.
Yes, so we chose two charities, one on behalf of Garland, which is the Capuchin Centre for the Homeless in Dublin, and the second is on behalf of Omar Fitzell from Dastram Good, which is Little Blue Heroes.
Excellent. So, as well as enjoying yourselves, everybody, you're helping those two great causes. So, thank you very much, much appreciated. And I want to thank everybody for coming out at an unusual time. I suppose particularly those in the States are just out of bed and drinking whiskey. So we hope you enjoy. So, Ger, if you'd like to unmute yourself, and I'll give you an introduction briefly. Ger Garland, brand ambassador for Irish Distillers, as I mentioned, fountain of knowledge for everything Irish whiskey, I would like to say, and a good friend, almost a neighbour, and delighted he could make it on the show. So, Ger, thank you for joining us, and perhaps you might like to give us a little intro uh, about yourself and about what we're going to be doing.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm very passionate about Redbreast, as you all know, and it's a brand I spend a lot of time talking about because simply I'm a huge fan, like both of you and really and many of the people that have tuned in today. And it's just such a rich in history. It's so rich in flavor, and it's such an evocative brand that makes it really interesting. And it's the brand that really got me into whiskey. And I think I'm nearly 20 years in the drinks industry, and my first encounter with Redbreast, from a tasting point of view, was in, I think, early 2001, where I met a guy who was doing a tasting for us from our distillery called Barry. And I didn't know who Barry was. And I was like, who's Barry? Oh, he works in the distillery. And it was Barry Crockett. And we were tasting the new vintage of Middle and Very Rare. We were looking at other products that were in our range at the time. And then we were shown this Redbreast whiskey, this Redbreast 12-year-old. And I was hooked immediately. Again, as I said, the story behind it. It is, it's the quintessential Irish whiskey. It's just so delicious, delivers every time, and it's amazing that we have the opportunity to taste the evolution of Redbreast over, nearly 70 years here you have of whiskey. So if you think about the first whiskey we're going to try, the one from the 1960s that Chris has, curated and put together this lineup, it was distilled in the 1950s, so 70 years ago. It's absolutely incredible that we're tasting a piece of history here, and these are becoming rarer and rarer and rarer. And it's likely that, for me, I think the first time I tasted this whiskey, the first whiskey we're going to try, I tried it in 2014, and it was thanks to collectors like Willie Murphy, who had saved and squirreled away lots of these older older bottles of whiskey, and it meant that he was able to release them at various tastings with the Irish Whiskey Society, with Celtic tastings. And Chris again has done a great job of putting together a great range here, and it's one of my favorite whiskies as well. So that's my little bit of a story around Redbreast and why I'm into it.
It'll be amazing to see how it's evolved, actually. Chris, do you mind showing us, Sarah, the bottle, please, for this particular one, the first one? So you can see it there, everybody. It's probably, the label has probably seen better days, but this is obviously it's a Bow Street, so it would be Bow Street up to 1970s anyway. And Ger, what's the difference with your bottle and Chris is there? Obviously, size. Near, far away.
Yeah, the difference is not much difference. It is the same border outline, same capsule closure. I think it's probably from a similar time. It's probably later in the 1960s, and that's more from just knowing by the capsule closure and just the outline on the label. So it's just in better condition, and this is one of my prized possessions. Obviously, I'm very lucky to have it.
Okay, so I poured myself a wee sample there. I think both of you two are more qualified to give a tasting note on this, I suppose. So,
well, I mean, for me, initially, obviously Chris is doing it the right way. He's looking at it first in the glass. You'll notice it has a good body on. You've these what you call legs, but you can see it's incredibly oily in the glass.
Yeah.
So that gives you an indication of the mouthfeel of what it's going to be like. The color is a lovely golden hue, but it's quite light compared to maybe what we're used to with more modern whiskies. But it still has a lovely golden rather than a copper type of hue to it.
Yeah, it's an ambery red almost.
Ambery red, yeah. For me, I think initially you get this kind of floral citrusy kind of lemon note to it. Even a little bit of rubber, you know, and I mean that in a good way. I mean, like, you know, like real rubber.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. It's still fresh. This is a
Amazing
whiskey
after all
again.
these years, that
All
it's
these years.
kept so much punch in the nose. Great.
Well, that's one of the things about it. Obviously, the label itself looks quite battered, but when it came to sourcing all the different whiskies that we'd use for events like this, it's all about the liquid level in the bottle, the seal of the capsule itself. You want to get it as close to that. This one was the equivalent to 750 mils, so you want to get it as close to that 750 mils as possible to make sure there's no oxidization. You can tell by the label, even though it has been through a good bit, it's not I don't know if it reflects on the camera, but it's not something that's been sitting in the window and stripped of color or anything like that. And you can tell when you actually crack it open and the legs are there. It's as oily and viscous as can be. The nose is very much alive. And after opening a couple dozen bottles of kind of things from the 50s to the 70s, eventually you'll cop if something's been a little bit oxidized, the ABV level drops. And as soon as that drops, that rubber note that we're getting wouldn't be there. The kind of lemon note we're getting wouldn't be there. The whole point of this, granted, the label doesn't look the prettiest in the world, but it's all about the liquid level to make sure that when we are actually doing this for tasting, I'm doing this for the experience, you're getting the actual experience itself, as opposed to drinking something old that may not be as it should be. With this one, everything is taken out of the bottle, measured. So this one dropped by 4 milliliters. So that's all that would disappear between the 1960s and now.
4 milliliters.
So yeah, just 4 milliliters was all. Across the whole lot of them, I'll cover it later, but across the whole lot of them, the most gap was 12 mils. And that was on the 80s one. So like this was as close to perfect as I could get with each one of them. And then you can just tell in the glass itself, the nose is completely and utterly alive. The color is still there, and that viscous, thick, oily, that could stay dripping down the glass for days.
Yeah.
Like
Fantastic.
the longer it's in the glass, for me, I'm getting like a more of a herbal type note, tobacco, cedar wood.
Through. Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. I'm just really dying to try it now, so I'm going to taste it. So I don't know about you. I really want to taste it now. Launcher. Oh wow. Oily initially, and then this pot still spice kicks in, followed by lovely balanced wood spiciness over the palate, and it fades away slowly. And it's just so oily, isn't it, lads? Like it's really
on it is incredible. Yeah. But
and
the
a nice
flavors,
yeah,
the flavors break apart as well quite quickly as well. You know, they separate out into you've got kind of mahogany, tobacco. It's quite different on the taste to the nose, actually, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anybody getting anything else?
Yeah,
I think the lemon note is kind
real
of
pop
still
olive
hanging
oil, that kind of real thick oily coatiness, and it's as if your mouth's being coated with the oil first, and it's just bringing across hints of that kind of old spice, hints of that kind of old, almost like real leather. And then as that gets to the back, all of a sudden the spice starts to develop. That lemon scented nose has kind of disappeared, maybe in the aftertaste, but in the middle, I'm getting more of that kind of herby floral.
Is anybody getting lemongrass at all?
Oh.
Any lemongrass off? No. I kind of.
No, after tasting it, I think it leans in more with the kind of the tobacco and that type of cedarwood type note tends to. Maybe it's because it's now that bitterness is on my palate after tasting it. I tell you, it's really drinkable though, isn't it? And quite.
Oh. So is this 46% still?
This one was 70 degrees under proof, so that would have worked out between 40 and 41%.
40.
So, yeah.
It's imperial proof.
It was just above 40. If you do the exact maths, it's 40%. But a few people I know that have tested the 70 degrees under proof have ended up being a little bit above 40.
Yeah.
And it's 26 and 2/3 fluid ounces, is it, Chris, as well, the bottle size?
Yeah, so they were
Yeah,
still
so which is 750 ml, and that was
Yeah,
it was
we're
the standard size.
still on
Yeah,
the imperial ones until we get to the third bottle.
yeah. So
so
750 ml was the
it's more,
standard size for all bottles.
Yeah, there's talk about unifying the size of bottles between the US and here. Is that anything you're hearing about?
Last year's the last time I heard about it, that the Europeans were petitioning to not have to have bigger bottle sizes to send the 700s all around the world. They have to okay it with the States and South Africa to both to get it uniformed. But a lot of them adapt, like the likes of Tullamore Dew and Powers and Jameson. The bottleneck actually fits the extra 50 mils. They don't. They fill to one level and then they fill above. Whereas a lot of the smaller companies will actually have to change the bottle completely.
And I suppose the color of the bottle itself would help preserve the whiskey as well. The fact that you don't really get direct sunlight on it.
Well, any light, Sergio's, is bad for whiskey.
Yeah, exactly.
And strictly speaking, if you're going to store a whiskey, you should store it in the box it came in an environment where the temperature isn't going to fluctuate too much, and basically that it doesn't get exposed to light. So all light is really bad, but it should be fine on the back bar for a couple of years. No, there's no problem. But basically, light is not good for whiskey.
Yeah. Well, certainly this hasn't oxidized at all, which is great.
No, it's beautiful. It's
really
absolutely beautiful, Chris. Thanks for organising that. That's really good.
Okay.
Do you get that clovey, spicy type finish on it?
Yep, you get the tingle on the end. Yeah.
Yeah, towards the end, that kind of clove oil kind of spice to it, really, really lingering. It's nice.
Yeah.
It's a little piece of history there. Like, that's amazing stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Look, that's a great start. So I think we'll have a look at the next one. Do you want to maybe, Jared, tell us a little bit about how Gilbey's started before we delve into the second one? And
yeah, sure.
The history and the importance it played.
Yeah, no problem. Well, the brothers that founded Gilbey's, they made their fortune in the Crimean War in the mid-19th century. And they came back to England and set up with the relaxing of, or the changing of the laws around trading of alcohol under Gladstone. They were able to sell alcohol off premise. So essentially the off license was invented. And they set up initially it was as we were talking earlier, it was like a mail order. So you would send your letter, your order, and they would deliver it to your household. So, and they continued on that business well into the mid 20th century, where you would have got delivery. You would have ordered your champagne and your sherry and your port and your cognac and your Irish whiskey, and you would have got it delivered from a catalogue. You would have ordered from a catalogue and it was delivered to your door. There was no real brand names. It would have said Irish whiskey catalogue number 25, for example.
Yeah.
So,
and I heard from Eric, like, in a very short space of time. It's incredible when you think back in the day, 1850s, late 1850s. They hit 20,000 customers very quickly, and in fact, one of their customers was Charles Dickens.
Wow.
And they actually took the check from Charles Dickens and put it in their office for a while. So that's one of the little bit of trivia.
But it was a very convenient way. They would send it to you in a sealed container, and where you were guaranteed good quality. And you went to your local tavern and you purchased a quart of wine, and and you bought another jar of whiskey. You weren't guaranteed the quality, and you had to bring your own vessel. It was a very convenient way of purchasing. Like, we're looking at the world now, and that's why it exploded. And they were, first in. They expanded really, really quickly, and they were all over. They had sub offices all over Britain, and then they expanded into Ireland later, and they had depots in Galway and Cork, and even if you go up to you go up to Thomas Street and you go beside a well-known German discount supermarket, there's a small coffee shop there, and if you look up, you'll see W&A Gilby. So they had small, what you would call off licenses around Ireland as well. And then they also had agents is the other thing, Sergio. So you could sign up and become an agent.
Well, they
So
had
what you could do,
2,500.
yeah.
They had 2,500 agents at one point between the
Yeah.
UK and Ireland. I saw, and they were certainly innovators, Ger,
Oh,
because
yeah, absolutely. Things we take for granted now were innovations, like brands
brands and
around.
bottling.
Yeah,
Brands.
huge. Because again, you would have gone to your local pub and bought a jar of whiskey or a quart of whiskey or whatever it was, and then you were able to purchase a bottle from them, guaranteed the quality, and they matured it themselves, they blended it themselves. It's really a business model that became standard operation.
Became the standard. The initial off licenses, I would say, and that was largely due to Gladstone passing those laws, and then he passing further laws to make bottling a formidable kind of competitor to getting casks. But he also, I mean, Gladstone also reduced the tariffs for spirits, for French wines in the UK.
Yeah.
And Gilbey's passed that on. And they were one of the few to actually pass that saving on to the customer. I think that's how they, initially their 90% of their business was wine and other spirits, and 10% was spirit.
And if you look at their catalog was champagnes, it was wines from France, yes, wines from Italy. They had wines from South Africa, Australia, and this is in the 1880s. Wines from South America, stuff that we all think is a new phenomenon. And basically, they were importing wine from Australia. It's absolutely incredible that they were doing.
Well, I mean, they started young as well. So they were 24 and 26 when they started. They got a grant or a funding from their older brother. They sent two young fellows over to Ireland to set up the international agency in 1858 in 31 Sackville Street, which is O'Connell Street nowadays. So, I mean, they were groundbreaking off licensees, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the building is no longer there. It was demolished in 1971. Their head office, which eventually moved to 46 to 49 O'Connell Street. And unfortunately, it was extensively damaged by fire in the early 20th century. And then they decided to demolish the building in 1971. And what's there now is essentially an office block, but behind it, they had a bottling hall. They had maturation warehouses in Hatch Street, which was at the end of the the line that came up from Wexford.
Where that pub is now. It was turned into a nightclub as well, I think, at one stage.
Where Pod nightclub used to be.
Nightclub, yeah.
Would have been the train station, Hatch Street, and basically that line went all the way down and linked up with the Rosslare line. So it meant that all of the wine and sherry and cognac that was imported into a port like Enniscorthy was put on a train and then brought to Dublin, and then ended up at the train station, and then out the back of that, Gilbey's had warehousing where they would mature. They would decant their ports, their sherries, their cognacs into bottles and distribute them around Ireland, to Galway, Belfast, Cork, etc., and obviously around Dublin.
They had Merrion Square as well, was where there were a lot of warehouses as well.
There was, yeah, but that was Findlaters had their warehousing subterraneously in Merrion Square, and then on Fitzwilliam Lane, of course, you had Mitchell's and Sons subterraneous warehouse as well. But Gilbey's had a big, they had big warehousing on Hatch Street now, which is mainly insurance, big insurance buildings and that sort of thing. Now they're all gone, but they moved when Powers moved out of Drury Street in 1965. Gilbey's moved in. So Powers in 1964 vacated Drury Street, which is their bottling hall, and they moved out to Fox and Geese, where our bottling hall is now today. And Gilbey's moved in and took over. And Gilbey's were there until they finished bottling in 1984 in Drury Street. And they also used the cellars there for maturation. But what I'm trying to get at is they imported sherries, cognacs, all this stuff. It meant they had a lot of empty barrels. So what are you going to do with those empty barrels? Well, you do what we would do today. You'd rock up to Bow Street Distillery and fill it full of pot still whiskey and then bring it back to your warehousing and mature it. And that's why it has this rich flavor, I think, Redbreast. And the quality of the casks they were getting in were obviously very good because they were a company with a good reputation. And they had full control of that. And it meant that the whiskies we're tasting are amazingly, good quality. Like, that's whiskey there we tasted was bottled like 60 years ago. And it's really good.
Yeah. Well, look, let's get on to the second one here. I've poured the second one now. So, Chris, maybe you want to tell us a little bit about this bottle and show us the bottle and tell us a little bit about it.
Oh, wow.
Business the right way. All right. We're now into the 1970s, and this is probably the best one to represent the conversation on cask that we just had. The sherry influence on the color, the sherry influence on the nose, the sherry influence throughout, the actual cask choices that they have for something that's almost 50 years old at this stage.
Yeah.
It's almost as fresh. If you told me this was bottled yesterday, I completely and utterly believe you.
The color is different as well.
Yeah. So the color on this one is probably 4, maybe 5 times darker. This does come across like a possibly could have been a wet barrel that it was put into, or wet fatting that it was put into. So, like, one of the things these days, when you get a sherry cask that could have sherry for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, when you empty it in Jerez and you move it across in wintertime, like Irish distillers do, there's a couple of days, if not a good few days, in between emptying it and physically getting to Ireland. The barrel will start to sweat a little bit, the sherry will come out, and of course this is disgorged before it's filled. Whereas with Gilbey's, when they empty a cask, if they wanted to roll it to Bow Street that afternoon, the next day, or within a very small period, they can do this. So there'll be a lot of sherry still inside the wood itself. So because this hasn't leached out and because it hasn't been disgorged, it can have a massive impact on color straight away and a massive impact on flavor as well.
So these are still 12-year-old whiskies.
These are still 12. Now, when Joe may be able to kind of touch on this a little bit more, but when you hop back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, when you're talking about a 12-year-old whiskey, you're usually talking closer to 12 than these days. So these days, when I say 12, I could have a 15, a 16, a 17, and 18 blended in to get a certain profile. Whereas with a lot of whiskeys back in the early days after World War II, when they said 10, they meant 10, or they meant 10 to 11 to 12. They usually wouldn't mean 10 to 19. But as I was saying, with wet casks, the impact of flavor you get on it, you can get a lot more quicker than these days. So these days you're leaving it in for an extra year or 2 or 3 to leach out the same amount of flavors and same amount of influence from the sherries. Whereas with a wet cask, you can get that very, very quickly.
Yeah, it's amazing. I'm watching Chris here sit down, and I can see the legs on his glass from here. It's amazing the thickness on this. But also, just one thing about the bottle, I think and it wasn't there initially. They have the initials JJ there on it. You can say it says, I think it's bottled by Gilbey's in Ireland.
Yeah.
So that JJ didn't stay there forever. Obviously, it was a nod to the fact that they got it from John Jameson's. They were the largest independent supplier or user of John Jameson or Irish whiskey, actually.
They were
worldwide at one point. They had 300,000 gallons in store.
So
for an independent retailer, that's incredible.
So what happened in the 1880s is that there was a contract signed with Gilbey's for Bow Street and John Jameson to be the sole supplier of Irish whiskey to them. Unfortunately, Irish whiskey was already in decline at that period, but it was still a huge seller for Gilbey's.
Yeah.
When you come to the early 20th century, Sergio, what happened was in the Canadian market in particular, that John Jameson was a lot more prominent on those Gilbey labels. And John Jameson was also exporting from their bottling hall in London to Canada. And essentially you had two products competing with each other with John Jameson on the label. So a series of legal correspondence goes back between Bow Street and Sackville Street at the time, saying come on, lads, now you're kind of you're pushing the John Jameson a bit much now. It should be more prominent with Gilbey's. And really, one of the reasons a solution had to be found about how to stop this conflict, because Gilbey still wanted the spirit supplied to them, and obviously Bow Street still wanted to supply them. And branding was becoming more important with brands, so they decided to come up with a series of brands based around birds. And Chaffinch, Yellowhammer, Redbreast, Skylark,
Merlin, I think, is the other. Yeah.
So Redbreast was born, and like the first official or the first advertisement I've seen is August 1912, but other people have found earlier, a little bit earlier, some evidence that it was called that a little bit earlier than that. But really, it came about because of that. There was a pragmatic reason why the Redbreast name was applied to it, and not just JJ&S whiskey liqueur. It became a brand, Redbreast, and it's around very much today. But it's people believe in brands, they take ownership in them, and they give you quality. They give you a signet, confidence of the quality of what's in the bottle.
Yeah.
But getting back to the whiskey,
sorry, quickly. But previously, there was 12-year-old JJ liqueur, and I think before that there was a 10-year-old JJ liqueur, and then after about 1912, like you say, they became branders and developed the Redbreast name. Do you know what happened to those other brands, the old ones?
They just fizzled out. The bigger sellers were kept on. And really, Redbreast was the one that people wanted, so that's what people bought. It's a bit, you find often where they probably had different brands, and Redbreast is the one that resonates with people. And Birdwatch Ireland, and you find the equivalent in the UK, and any surveys that are done about people's favorite bird, the robin redbreast tends to be either the favorite bird of most people. So it's a prolific bird. It's synonymous with the nativity. It's a good reason why Redbreast became the priest tipple, because Gilbey's were the altar wine suppliers to the priests in Ireland.
Yeah.
So it meant this is a very popular whiskey among the clergy at one time, and probably they could afford it as well.
Yeah, it was the priest tipple. That was the good bottle of whiskey that was always kept aside for the priest visiting the house, which would have been something. And there were back then, 1920s or so, you had an awful lot more clergy than you do now. So they probably kept Gilbey's alive, during the difficult times. There were, up to 15,000 clergy or something back then. So it would have been.
So they weren't the only people drinking Redbreast, but it's just an interesting caveat.
Yeah,
and listen, the whiskey itself, like Chris, you were saying about Chris's glass, there is amazing legs on it. And as Chris said, it's darker. Well, it's older for a start, but also Chris is absolutely right. There's more of an influence here from that European oak. It's really, it's not it really is a different whiskey. I wouldn't say it's totally different. It's in the same style that you'd be used to with Redbreast, but it's to me like when you nose it, you get just much more influence from what than you got from the previous whiskey. It's maybe not as balanced. There's much more of that vanilla note to it. It's not as fresh as the other whiskey, but still is very fresh.
So more molasses there as well, or more caramel on the nose.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of like.
First time sitting down to these, I felt the 10 to the 12-year-old is very similar to the 15 to the 12 these days. That not saying that it's second fill, but it's more spirit driven than wood driven itself. The 10-year-old is beautiful, but from what I've heard, the 12 was becoming so popular after kind of World War II going into the 1960s that to keep up with demand, keep up with stocks, the reason why the 10 slipped in was just to kind of alleviate the demand. This one was sourced from the UK, so it would have been Gilbey's send it from Ireland to the UK. The person who owned it, it was wrapped in newspaper from 19. What did I say? November 1969 was the newspaper. I'm still trying to get them to, if they still have the original newspaper, actually physically send it
That would be
across.
nice.
Cool thing to have it side by side. But was it November 1969 is when it was wrapped in newspaper, and the assumption behind that is it would have been bought in a merchant's or a bonder's kind of grocers, wrapped in the physical newspaper and brought home, sat in an attic and pretty much untouched. And then they took it out, said went in the cabinet for about 20-25 years, hence the actual label looking like that. But that was just the exposure. But they said the cabinet was never facing windows and stuff like that, so hence no light. Great.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the 12-year-old that, like pour number 2 that we have in front of us, it's almost night and day. It is still following that, still has oil, still has a good bit of spice. You can tell that it's the same style of distillate coming from Jameson. Whether the mash bill's changed a little bit, the casking has changed a little bit, it's hard to know. It certainly is older, it certainly is darker, and it does feel like there's a lot more of a European oak, that kind of fortified wine influence on it.
Yeah. No, it's
like there's still fruit there, but it's not like lemon. It's more kind of grapefruity, orange peel. You know that. Do you know what I mean? That bitterness, the pit in orange peel. You're getting but it's bitter like coffee, but it's not coffee. Like, it's hard to explain. It's not as distinct flavors. It's not as balanced as the last whiskey. It really reminds me like of an old Dublin whiskey, but it's really spicy, isn't it? Like, it's effervescent on your side of your palate.
Yeah, I think this one touches the side of your palate more, the side of your tongue more than the other one.
Yeah, if you let it fall beneath your tongue and then bounce it back up, it really coats the spice, elevates the whole way through. If you just let it slip down the sides, then it catches your cheeks and really holds on. It's something that if you did genuinely sit down over half an hour, you could actually pick 5 or 6 or 7 different kind of layers to it. The first one is more of a blender's dream. There's a good uniform flavor structure to it. This one seems to be a little bit more wood dominated, not in a bad way in any way, shape or form, but the flavors are a little bit more robust. Fantastic. The spice levels in it are just beautiful. But you've got the kind of clove oil from the first one. This one for me is more kind of like mace oil. It's a little bit more of a fruity spice.
There's definitely raisins, and you're definitely getting that dried fruit characteristic in there. The fortified wine, I think, is giving it a lot of influence. Again, the European oak. Like, it's just wonderfully rich. Yeah.
Would the distillers that had gone into these casks have changed much, Ger, over that period? Like, would the new make have changed very much between the decades?
Yeah, well, you're talking about a closed distillery, and a distillery that hasn't distilled anything since June in 1970. So 50 June in 1970. So from my point of view, from what I've tasted, I mean, they did get new stills in the 1930s. I've tasted some whiskey from before then. They were constantly, I suppose, tweaking things and looking at stuff. But I'll be perfectly honest with you, I don't know, because I wouldn't have been as close to it, say, as I would be to even John's Lane or to the distillery in Middleton. From what I know, I don't think it changed a whole lot, Sergio's, from decade to decade in Bow Street in particular. So again, that's only from what I know from talking to people internally and people that would have worked there. And obviously, I got my first job in the counting house across the road, working for them.
Yeah, brilliant. I'll just click over to our listeners here. If you have any questions you'd like to put to Ger or Chris, might be a good time to pop in a few comments or questions there. Love to hear your feedback on what you're tasting, what you think of it so far.
Yeah, just on the recipes itself, it'll probably be about 3 to 5 years by the time Carol Quinn has gone through the records and can kind of go back through it and actually pinpoint if there was any changes or if there was any iterations in it. I know she said previously that John Jameson kept strict notes himself on if he did make any alterations or if there was a small percentage difference in the volume of oats that he got that week, or wheat that he got that week, or malt that he got that week. He was actually dictating exactly what it was he was doing throughout. It'll take her a couple of years to get through all the historical records, but at least it is something that we'll be able to answer over time.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, I think there are more records for Powers than there are for Redbreast, though, if I'm not mistaken. Are there?
Yeah. I mean, Powers was a much more progressive distillery. It's not to say that Bow Street wasn't it was just a different distillery. It wasn't as modern as John's Lane was. They were constantly investing in infrastructure, and they were a bigger seller of whiskey. Jameson made a lot of supplied a lot of bottlers with whiskey, and they made only pot still whiskey, as we know, and basically, from the point of view, you're talking about two totally different distilleries with different cultures, and the way it was a Victorian distillery, even in the mid 20th century. Bow Street was a Victorian distillery, whereas John's Lane was really modern, progressive. Used a lot more progressive techniques in distillation, and that's what makes it wonderful and rich. All of the different approaches and cultures to making whiskey, even within the same city, and they're only like to walk between the two of them is 10 minutes. Like it's very, very close to each other.
Going into rooftop gardens and football teams and fire teams.
I mean, they were staunchly competitive distilleries, weren't they? Absolutely,
yeah, they were. But Powers was a bigger seller. It was a bigger whiskey. It had, they were a bigger distillery. They sold more whiskey. Jameson was mainly a Dublin distillery. Or Bow Street was mainly supplying the Dublin market, and up till the late 1960s, you would have gone into a bar, say like the Palace Bar, and you would have looked at the back bar and seen 5 different bottles of Jameson, all in different molds of bottles with different labels, supplied by different bottlers. And that led to, as it just led to, I suppose, a lack of consistency from a branding point of view. People weren't able to grab onto it. That iconic green bottle that we know, that we see in the back bar today, all over the world, really that started when the families, Powers family, the Jameson family, and the Murphys came together in 1966, and they essentially looked at everything they were doing and thoroughly modernized all of the approach that they had to making whiskey, to marketing whiskey, and also with the brands to bring them into the 20th century and really say, well, look, we fundamentally have to look at everything here: packaging, way we're making things. And so they decided to build a brand new distillery down in Middleton, but also they decided to create that iconic bottle that we know now today. So people always expect, Jameson has been around for a very long time, as we know, since 1780, but it is a recent phenomenon, if you can call, 50 years ago. So in the world of whiskey, 50 years is probably a small amount of time.
Yeah. Look, I wanted to touch on the Irish distillers, vintners. So when Gilbey's were approached and taken over by IDB, things did change a little bit then, did they?
They did. So in 1984, which is very good, because the next whiskey that we're going to try is the last of the Gilbey's bottlings. And basically, 1984, you have whiskey up to, so from what we hear, there was basically whiskey in warehouse that was, 28, 30 years old, 32 years old in warehouse that was being bottled, because they started bottling everything really as they were taken over, because the brand was now going to be not produced by IDB anymore. They didn't really want to go down that direction. And the brand then was bought by Irish distillers, but all of their stock wasn't taken on by Irish distillers. It was actually bottled by them. And then in 1991, Irish distillers started
So that was the
producing it
first
again.
one. That's when it stopped saying produced by Gilbey's of Ireland. Was in 1991.
Yeah, 1991. But there was a gap of between essentially 1985, if you want to call it, and 1991. There was no Redbreast being bottled. But guess what? It never went out of style.
They had stock though, Gilbey's still, didn't they?
They had stock because they bottled everything in 1984. So they were selling, but because the volume, the consumption levels of whiskey were so low compared to what they are now, even today, it meant it took them that period of time to sell it. So it actually never went out of stock, unfortunately. Whereas nowadays, you know, the volumes they were selling then, we'd probably sell in a month. You know, Redbreast is growing at a phenomenal rate. It's, you know, it's really, really successful and is driving the premium whiskey category for Irish whiskey and introducing people to it. But it's just where, again, if you look at it from the lens of now, it is when I even started in the whiskey business in 20 years ago, the volumes that we were selling then are so much smaller than even now today. You know, whiskey has grown massively, particularly in the last decade, which is brilliant. You know?
But in 1991, when it did come out, it was marketed for, I think the quote was "those in the know," if I'm not mistaken, in 1991. So people that knew their history and were going back, they were kind of saying, "Yeah, here's our old favorite back again." So, but look,
absolutely. But we haven't left Gilbey's yet. So this bottle that Chris has was bottled in Drury Street. So you see it there. This is the last of the Gilbey's bottlings. You know, 1980s. It could be 82, Chris. It could be, you know, but it is the last of the bottlings. It's the red cabinet. It probably is one of the later bottlings that comes from there. It is much what I would call dustier and meatier than the previous two. You know, there's still a lot of fruit there on the nose, and it's distinctly that kind of Redbreast, you know, influence from those fortified wine casks or the European oak or those sherry barrels.
Yeah. I'm actually getting a less powerful nose on this one than I was on the previous two.
Yeah, it's a much older whiskey than 12 years of age.
Right.
You know, we don't know exactly how old it is. So Tim Corbett, one of our colleagues who unfortunately passed away in the last number of months, was a rep for Gilbey's in the southeast, and Tim was an absolute gentleman. Worked in our shop in Middleton, but had a vast experience in the whiskey, in the wine and spirits industry over, you know, 4 decades. And Tim put me in touch with the former bottling hall manager of Drury Street for Gilbey's, who happens to live in East Cork, and now he retired to East Cork after he left. And he was saying there was whiskey in there up to 36 years of age in the very last bottlings. But for me, this is still quite fruity. That's why I'm, again, using just experience and having tasted these things before. I think this is probably, you know, maybe 82, 83. It's not the very last ones are, what I can tell you, are dusty, you know, really, really overwooded. But I'm still getting a lot of fruit from this, like stewed red apple, that type of note to it.
Yeah, more on the red fruit side for sure.
Red fruit, and but it is. The reason you're saying it's not as spicy, it's because it's really very, very mellow, because it's been aged for such a long period of time.
So this could have whiskey up to 18 years of age in this, or
older.
Really?
Yeah, older, and very, very lucky. Just Ireland's a small country. You know, Tim was able to put me in touch with the bottling hall manager, and I asked him about different things, and he said, at the very last bottling, they were putting casks of 36-year-old whiskey in there. You know,
do you know how it came about that Grand Met sold the brand to IDL? I mean, I know Gilbey's went on to pursue Bailey's.
They wanted the wine. Sergio's, they purchased the wine brands, Gilby's wine brands. They didn't
Right.
want this niche, small bottling in a a small island,
Yeah.
off Western Europe. They wanted those big wine like Barton and Gestier.
Yeah.
These are all big brands they wanted. They didn't want this little, quite complicated brand that had, you had to purchase aged stock, which is no longer available from the
Yeah.
distillery that you had recently purchased it for. It was too much of a headache for them. So they just said, would you like this? We don't really particularly are, interested in producing this. And I think again, it's a single pot still whiskey. It's our traditional style of whiskey, and there was a commitment to continue to produce this style in
Yeah.
Middleton when we moved distilling from Dublin. So it totally fitted with what we were trying to do. And
Yeah.
initially, Edward Dillon were the people who distributed this brand for us, and then Barry and Fitz. Sorry, not Barry and Fitz. Fitzgerald and Company, which
Mhm.
is the company I initially started working for briefly, which became a wholly owned subsidiary of Irish Distillers, and then it became an Irish Distillers brand.
Yeah.
After that, so 1991 is when Irish Distillers started making it. I suppose taking over the maturation and the bottling. And Gilby's, you're looking at late, 1984, when, as you said, Grand Met and United Beverages essentially took over the whole thing. So
Yeah. So I mean, in the early 70s, was it IDB decided that they were no longer going to be supplying third party
no, it was
suppliers,
early
or
1970s. It was Irish Distillers.
Irish?
So
Okay.
yeah, so IDL said that basically the business model that had been previously to supply wholesalers and bonders with bulk stock, we were going to give notice to not renew the contracts
Yeah.
over that period in the early 1970s, with the exception of one,
Green spot. Yeah.
which is Mitchell's, and that
Yeah.
was a very small niche brand at the time, and now it's getting great success and is really popular. The spot range is growing all the time. I hope to see more from that range in the future sometime. And
Yeah. Something
Redbreast,
pretty soon we're expecting. Well, I have you pinned, Jer. We might be
I
expecting something pretty soon from
well,
the spot
I
range.
wouldn't know. I wouldn't know anything about that. But we're talking
Okay.
about Redbreast today. I don't. I have very
Yeah.
little information about what goes on
So the opposite
in the
color to
story.
red, I would say. But Chris, what do you
I'm
think of this number 3?
And number 3 is fantastic. It's a lot lighter than the first two. Does remind me of kind of Paris Gold Label when it comes to the spice, and a little bit less oil, which you get from Gold Label with the grain element coming in. The pot still spice, there's a good bit of fruit there. The spice itself is a lot more calm. It's a lot more kind of that raw spice driven, as opposed to clove oils and that kind of oily spice. It's a lot more kind of similar to the bacon spice itself in the powder form. A little bit of cinnamon off it. The kind of citrusy element has got a lot more grapefruit, stepping away from the orange and the lemon. Quite nice. The ABV we've dropped down to 40%. So that could be
Okay.
adding to the fact that the impact has come down a little bit. We've dropped to 3% from the bottle number 2.
Yeah. I mean,
It's also
the
it's
premium
baked away.
Gilby's,
Yeah,
the premium Gilby's back in the late 1800s was being bottled at 57%. And that was their, like, they had the 3 brands, I think, that we talked about earlier there. And this was, their 12-year-old was bottled at 57%, which I suppose is pretty equivalent to the modern day cask strength version of Redbreast.
yeah. It's it certainly is. Look, if we're going to try Redbreast cask strength later on, and certainly there is more of an appetite for it now. And I think the reason for this is the minimum you could bottle, say 70% proof, which equated to 40% ABV, and you tend to find that that tends to be the industry standard. They bottle it at. But as you said, the premium, there obviously was an appetite and a market for cask strength. And certainly, I suppose in 2011, when we brought back cask strength, we certainly realized that, and there's more and more demand for it. But I know there's a lot of whiskey drinkers, and hopefully some that are listening that are big fans of cask strength whiskey and want, it to be all the whiskey they drink and all the new whiskeys we bring out to be at that level. But you have to remember there are a lot of people that are not experienced or equipped enough to be able to cope with a cask strength whiskey. So there are people that happily would be happy to drink a 40% ABV whiskey, and that's their palate. So I think cask strength whiskey will be reserved as a premium product. I think for connoisseurs like yourselves to consume, because you want to try something that is unadulterated, not chill filtered, that is, straight essentially as it came out of the barrel and into your glass. But
I do have a bottle of water, but I'm actually, these are so rare, I'd be ashamed to add water to them. But I mean, tasters and blenders obviously bring them down quite a bit of level just to expand the flavors and evaluate the product more. But Chris, have you anything else to say about this particular one?
Just touching on the cask strength, if you were to hop back to from the 60s and below for a lot of brands, especially merchants and bonders, one of the bars that we have is JK and Walsh's in Waterford, and for years they were merchants, bonders, spirit grocers. They would get in a full cask, and it was up to them to dilute it themselves, to bottle it themselves, label it themselves, and it was part of a contract between themselves and John Jameson, themselves and John Powers, to cut it with water, bring it down in ABV, and be trusted to bottle it at the right amount.
So that was one of the arguments that they decided, well, look, we're going to take control of our products and protect our brand by not distributing.
Well, that's it. Like you're handing, as John Jameson, he's handing his liquid over to Gilbey's and entrusting that they're going to bring it down to a certain ABV. They're going to sell it as their own, but they still have the name on the brand. When you're handing it over to a bar or to a company, you're still doing the same thing. You're entrusting that, one, they're not going to cut the liquid with some other source. They're going to stick with 100% John Jameson and Sons, and they're going to bottle it as is, or they're going to bottle it under their own their blend themselves. And when at the end of the day, it's still John Jameson and Sons names on the label, it's still their brand in behind it, and it's still the consumer who recognizes that. So as you were saying earlier on, when it came to two whiskies being in America, both with the same name on it, even though they're coming technically from two different sources, you're still recognizing that JJ&S, you're still recognizing that John Jameson and Son. And unfortunately, back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, throughout, there was people who were illiterate, and they would recognize a Redbreast, or they would recognize the Redbreast name, they'd recognize the JJ&S or the Three Swallows. There'd be something on the label that they might be able to recognize, as opposed to the full details that we can read right here, right now. And because of whatever it is they're recognizing, they're asking, can I have the Three Swallows? They might be able to say Powers, they might be able to read it, but they're asking for the Three Swallows. If you hop a little bit further in time, when we have the actual Redbreast itself on the label, there's certain brands around the world that would have had animals, or something that is recognizable, something that you would say in everyday life instead of reading.
And that was literally due to illiteracy, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
And so that's one of the reasons why some brands became very, very popular.
So it's interesting, Jameson had stars to indicate age, as Chris was saying. So 1 star is a 5-year-old, 2 stars, 7-year-old, 3 stars, a 10-year-old. The swallows started off with like that as well, Chris. There was 1 swallow for a 5-year-old, 2 swallow for a 7-year-old, and 3 swallow for a 10-year-old. So they stole this moniker from the cognac industry. So VS, VSOP, 1 star, 2 star, 3 star. So basically, the idea was cognac pre-phylloxera was actually the biggest spirit drink in Ireland, and then phylloxera came along, and those little aphids or viruses, they thought at the time, killed the vines in Europe, and it meant that the price of cognac went through the roof. But because in Ireland they were big cognac drinkers, even the bottle shape that we love about Redbreast, particularly one Chris, if you lift up the old bottle shape, they stole that shape essentially from the cognac industry.
Okay.
And a little beside is also there's a well-known cream liqueur brand, which also has a very similar bottle shape, and they got the bottle
May have
shape
been mentioned about 20 minutes ago.
from the Gilbey's bottle. So yeah, so that's it. So yeah.
The other point of interest that I didn't know was that port actually outsold sherry up until about the late 1900s or late 1800s. So port was a bigger seller in England particularly than sherry. So Gilbey's kind of copped onto the trend of moving from port to sherry. They really had an amazing foresight, actually. From doing the distribution model, going to the bottle size, going to the off licenses, going to the sherry finish. They were groundbreakers, I suppose, of their time. And look, the brand has survived till today, which is amazing.
And they sourced their sherries and ports and their Irish whiskey directly from the source. Yeah. So that's what I was saying. In 1886, I think John Jameson went to London and signed that exclusivity contract to supply them. So it was not. It was they didn't buy it from a merchant they went straight to the bodega and purchased the sherry, or they went straight to the port house in the Douro Valley and they purchased the port directly from what were probably Scottish, Irish, and French families anyway. And Bordeaux wine directly from Bordeaux, and again, a lot of Irish families in cognac, a lot of English and Irish families in Bordeaux as well. So, I mean, there was that big network going on there as well. But there is records that sherry, we were the largest per capita consumers of sherry in the world in Ireland at the turn of the 20th century. So it meant there was a lot of empty sherry barrels, and that's why you get this big sherry influence on, I suppose, the whiskies that we love. It's there in Redbreast, it's there in Jameson. We like the influence of sherry barrels in our whiskey.
Excellent. Okay, I think what we're going to do, actually, folks, if that's okay, we're going to take a 5-minute break. I'm going to change the battery on my phone because we don't normally do shows that are 2 hours long, and we'll come back in 5 minutes. We'll leave you with I'll leave Chris and Ger here with you, and I will pop out and just come back in 5 minutes if that's all right. If there are any questions, please feel free to pose it to the guys. Thanks very much. Am I in mute? Oh, you can. I can't hear myself. Okay. Hello, everybody. Oh, now I can. Welcome back. I hope you had a little bit of a breather there and a bit of a break, and we'll get back into it. So I suppose number 4 on the list is, obviously we're getting closer to what we expect modern-wise, and this is Chris. You tell us a little bit about this, how you came to acquire it, and why you chose this one.
Right. So these days, there's a jump between the 12, the cask strength, and the 15-year-old, and 3 different whiskies will usually divide the room on which one's your favorite, because they bring you in 3 completely different directions. The 12-year-old is quite sherry forward. The cask strength gives you the best of all worlds, and the 15-year-old relies a lot on second fills and is a lot more distillate driven, very similar to the first. With this one, it's regarded as quite sacred. This is the very first 15-year-old that was released. It was released for the La Maison du Whisky's 60th anniversary in 2006. And I can't get the light on this again. As it, you can always tell it's L5346371. And that little tiny code, which is usually sitting just underneath the 700 mil mark, that will tell you the difference between the original 15-year-old for La Maison and the next like 4 batches. The very, very first one is like the rest of them at 46%, but it includes a certain amount of older whiskies and a certain amount of traditional pot still, which is a lot heavier and a lot more viscous than your mud pot and your light pot. With this one, it's almost night and day. It's absolutely fantastic, and it created such hysteria when it came to the flavor profile. It claims because it was a massive jump from the 12-year-old. It's still same style, still same profile that you would associate with Redbreast, but it was distillate driven as opposed to cask driven.
Yeah.
Which is
and this one, Ger, as well, I think. This one, I feel, is one of the neglected ones in the range, the 15-year-old. I think possibly because it is so different to the 12 and the 21. It doesn't have that kind of
it's half the price.
Flavor.
Half the price of 21-year-old, but not half as good. And as Chris said, it's more distillate driven than 12-year-old because of the use of refill casks for the first time. And it's, this was a limited bottling, as Chris said, to celebrate the 60th anniversary of La Maison de Whiskey. And basically, it's, approximately 15 to 19 years of age is the approximate age range. 15 being the youngest whiskey in it. But there's second and third fill barrels used in here as well. So, compared to, say, Redbreast 12-year-old, it doesn't have that big influence from the wood that you find. There's 2 ways to reduce the influence from the wood, and one of those is to reduce the age, and the other is maybe to use casks that have been used before. So these casks have been used to make Irish. They've been used to make American whiskey before. They've been used to make Irish whiskey before, and then they're used to make Redbreast 15-year-old. And the same with the sherry butts that are used here as well. And the other thing to say about it is that at the time there wasn't a huge appetite to expand out the Redbreast range, and there's 2 gentlemen that were involved here, Michael Boren and Michael Cunningham. So the 2 mix, and Michael were very much involved in the travel, retail, and export side of the business. And they went down to Middleton, saw all of the jewels that they had down there that people really, maybe didn't have the knowledge or the experience to say, where's the opportunity to put these whiskies. And everything from the label that Chris showed to, the description on the bottle was hugely influenced by the 2 lads and what they wanted to go to this customer, La Maison de Whiskey, which is a lovely whiskey shop in Paris, but also one of the biggest wholesalers of spirits in Europe. So It's amazing that this product came about at all. And then when it did come about, as Chris said, writers like Dave Broom and other whiskey writers were really excited by this whiskey, and from, as Chris said, the flavor profile and what it was. But it is lighter. It's more herbal. It's not as fruity as you get from Redbreast 12-year-old. It's 46%. It's non-chill filtered, bottled in 2015. Late in the year in 2015, and obviously 2006 was the year it was launched. Do you understand what I mean by that more kind of herbal note? It's more grassy, dry grass.
Fresh cut grass, yeah.
Yeah. It's not like, it's more like if there is green fruit there, if there is fruit, it's green fruit, like gooseberry, that kind of thing, delicious all the same.
Can you hold the bottle up there again, Chris?
Yeah, of course.
For Ronan wanted to have a closer look at it there.
Ronan Pallant.
Ronan wants to see, is it his bottle?
Yeah.
So it can be if you ever visit
it. You can see non-chill filtered on the label. You can see, age 15 years, yes. But the branding is old. It looks old. It's, it looks antique. At the time, this was a one-off. It was done, again, as I said, two gentlemen recognized that there was this amazing stuff down in Middleton that people like Barry Crockett, his father, and Brendan Monks, who was the master of maturation and the blender at the time, these guys had, experimented with lots of stuff, and were really, really lucky, because if they hadn't done all of this experimentation, all of the new expressions around Redbreast, and then that dedication to wood quality that was accelerated by Kevin O'Gorman when he was head of maturation, and those distillates that were created by Barry Crockett and his father, and that were essentially custodians of the pot still whiskey at the time. And now there's loads of other people making it. Basically, they wouldn't have been able to, we wouldn't have had all of these barrels of stuff down in Middleton to be able to do something like this. And 2005 is not that long ago in my lifetime. It's 15 years ago. But in the way whiskey has moved on since then, it's just absolutely incredible. And again, it was done, I think they redid this in 2008 and 2009 as well, and then eventually decided in about I think 9 years ago that this would become a permanent member of the Redbreast family. So
the 2008
the
2008 one was made available in the distillery, I think, down in Middleton last year or the year before. They found some old bottles and they put them up.
Yeah,
and
it was different. It was different to the one both Chris had and to the one we have now today. So the one now today is more in the vein of the 2005 bottling, 2006 edition, and 2009. And basically, if you drink Redbreast 15 today, it's more like this. The 2008 is it's different. Sorry, Joseph, just the difference.
Well, can you give us any breakdown on the mix of malted to unmalted in this, or the different styles of pot still that were used?
Yeah, so there's two different types of pot still used in. In this one, actually, there's three different styles in the one we're tasting. Normally with Redbreast, you have two different styles of pot still: a light style of pot still, and a more medium style of pot still. And those two are aged. One is aged exclusively in ex-American whiskey barrels, and the other is aged in both ex-American whiskey barrels and ex-bourbon barrels. And then they're aged for, in this case, 15 to 19 years. And they're refill barrels in the case of 15-year-old. So that's why this 15-year-old, the La Maison, the whiskey 15-year-old, is not as fruity as the 12-year-old, because it reduces the influence of the wood in the whiskey.
So Matt Kelly is asking a question here. The initial batch that was launched in the US, was that more in line with the current version?
Yeah, it would have been. Yes, is the answer to that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's more in line with the current version, or looking back at the 2005 version, that would have been essentially what they were trying to emulate. But you have to remember that the whiskies that were used in the 2005 were from a very limited amount of experimental casks. So they weren't able to replicate it exactly because, every barrel is unique, and the barrels that were used in the 2005 whiskey there was a very limited amount of them. So they had to build stock back up for the relaunch of the barrel of the whiskey that Matt is talking about, and which would have been 9 years ago.
Yeah.
Hopefully that makes sense.
And Brian Hennessy had a question there, and Chris, maybe you could give us the answer. What was the price on purchasing this? Like, to come across this now,
Individually, start to finish, or
this particular 15-year-old individually?
From door to door, 156.
It's great value.
Yeah, and this was a couple months before La Maison de Whiskey re-released the 2006 bottling, which was like 180, 190 euros, I think. It was less than two anyway. But yeah, you can find the 15-year-old at auction every so often. It's extremely rare, except for Irish whiskey auctions, where you will see them stating in the comment section beneath, or description section beneath, that it is this code and it is the specific one, not the 2008 and 2009.
Yeah. So,
but
just
yeah,
explain that the L code Chris is talking about on the bottom, L, and then there's a number. The number relates to the year. So if it's 5, it's 2005. The next three numbers, whether they begin with a 0, a 1, or 2, or 3, are the Gregorian day. So if it's 001, it's the first day of the year, which is January 1st. And if it's 365, it's the 365th day of the year, which is New Year's Eve. So that's an easy indicator. And then the rest relate to the bottling line, the place it was bottled, the bottling line, the time of day, the batch, all that sort of stuff. So
I'm reading the barcodes wrong.
I wouldn't bother. The barcode means nothing.
Yeah.
I don't think there isn't even a barcode on the bottle anymore, because it's on the box.
Okay.
So
it's on the box, and it's just beneath the 700 mils, usually just below the label, kind of in a print form. It's so light you could barely see it, that kind of thing. It's almost like a hologram.
Wow.
Yeah.
This is the second example of a whiskey from Irish distillers that basically it's a consumer whiskey. So Black Barrel was originally released for the States, or sorry, for the South American market, or South African market, sorry. And when people outside of South Africa from Ireland got a chance to taste it, this is something completely unique from Jameson. They got a taste for it, and all of a sudden there was demand for it. And this 15-year-old is another example of it. The 60th anniversary was only supposed to be a one-off. Yeah. Eventually there was enough demand for it that they decided to do it again, and then all of a sudden from 2011 this is actually a permanent SKU.
Like Caskmates.
Yes, and which is quite funny, because as you were saying earlier on, when you jump from price point and taste point from the 12-year-old to the Castor and 15 to the 21, it is very different because it's second fill and third fill, but it is only in existence because of the people who appreciate the taste of it and the people who demanded it, so to speak. That's the reason why this exists. And it's also the reason why the 21 exists, because this is 15 to 19 years old. So there's no point in having a Redbreast 18-year-old. You already have 19 years old in this. So you have to go higher to get it. And because the 21-year-old goes so far up, that's how we end up with something even higher.
Yeah, and I imagine the vatting process, Ger, for this is actually pretty complicated.
So, the vatting process from the point of view of how the different components are put together.
Yes, yeah.
So all of that,
so many different.
So many different components. Well, all of that is worked out by our blenders, Billy Lighton. Currently our blenders now, Billy Lighton and Dave McCabe. So they will work out exactly the proportions of what should be added, of exactly what it is, how much should be married together at any one time. And they obviously empty or dump or a disgorge, I prefer to use. The same, they empty the whole barrel. They don't do it in a little bit here, a little bit there. They'll empty the whole barrel. So it's 1 barrel of this, 3 barrels of that, 4 barrels of that. So it is from obviously the recipe, if you want to call it that, or the total makeup of the blend is a secret, because it's their skill, but they work all that out themselves, and they do it on a smaller scale in their lab, and then that is then a warrant is sent down to the warehousing for the casks that are to go into that batch to be brought up to the vat house, and then they're all disgorged in a bond and then basically vatted together in the vat house. So it's I think any whiskey is complicated, Sergio, whether it's Jameson or it's do you know what amazes me is how consistently they're managed to get the whiskey to taste thereabouts exactly the same all the time. It's just because I think it's still the quality of the inputs going in, but it's also the skill of people you can't underestimate the skill of people like Billy Lighton or Dave McCabe. I've been naively tried to blend a few things together. My God, it's really, really tough job.
Blending them is easy. Blending them, it's making them taste good. That's the problem.
Well, he does that too.
I'm an excellent blender, but I'm a terrible. The result is terrible. But never mind.
I'm good at drinking it, though. I think I'm better.
Yes.
But it's fascinating that essentially all of these whiskeys, the first 3 whiskeys we tried were distilled in one distillery, essentially from probably a very similar mash bill. It wouldn't have been. I don't think there would have been a huge variation. Again, I don't know exactly, but from talking to people and any articles I've read about it, I don't think there would have been a huge variation. And then you have a company that would have consistently brought in good quality casks from the same suppliers, and then would have known a lot about blending themselves. But you get 3 totally different whiskies because of age profile, because of circumstances. And then we move on to a whiskey that was essentially an experiment. The Limates on the whiskey one, and it's only because there was 2 passionate fellas about pot still whiskey that met a group of passionate people in Middleton Distillery and were able to kind of say, what have you got that's special that we can bring to a customer and show them to celebrate their anniversary. And now, none of this can be taken for granted. That's all I'm saying. It's
no, but one thing I do like, one thing I really do like about the Redbreast is every year, every batch is slightly different. There is something slightly different. And I have tasted several batches, and I do have 1 or 2 that really stand out for me. I mean, the Redbreast cask strength from last year, I thought was one of the best that's come out for a long time. The one I actually have here, that was kindly given and consumed. But excellent. Okay, well, look, let's move on because we're not going to be here all night, I hope.
Really, you want to try the dream cask? What? Do you really want to?
I was actually going to say, if you want to go to the Dreamcast first before the cask strength, even though we're going
cask strength
up.
is
let's go to the Dreamcast next. Why not?
It fits in 2 different ways. One, the cask strength is going to be quite intense, and the Dreamcast, there might be a couple of different things that people miss. And the second thing is, as it's 28 plus years old, it actually goes back in time further than the cask strength. So even though it was bottled afterwards, it does fit the timeline.
Okay, so let's do that. Let's go with the 28-year-old, everybody, and there's showing us there a lovely bottle of direct Redbreast 28. Yes. And Chris.
So go ahead.
So my first question was, how did this Dreamcast program come about?
So it came about simply because Billy Lighton, our master blender, was asked at a World Whiskey Day event, I think in 2016, if you were to have what they call, a dream dram in other countries, what would be, if you could pick any whiskey in Middleton Distillery what would that dream whiskey be? And Billy was kind of like, oh, that's actually a really good question. So what he did was, the following year for World Whiskey Day, he decided to showcase a 31-year-old single pot still all sherry whiskey. And some lucky, I think about 100 whiskey writers and bloggers and that sort of thing were sent out a little bottle, actually not too dissimilar from this size, with a glass and a sample of this 31-year-old whiskey. And obviously, a sherry butt is what, 500 liters. So they bottled, a small amount. I'm trying to think what size the bottles were, but it wasn't much. It was maybe 20 liters of whiskey. And then what happened was, then the following year in 2018, they decided then to sell the remainder of that cask, the 32-year-old single pot still all sherry cask, on the Birdhouse website, on the www.redbreastwhiskey.com/redbreast Birdhouse, the members area of the website. So all you had to do was sign up. You got an email out to say it was going on sale on the website at a certain date, and it absolutely flew out. I think it took a couple of hours to sell. I don't think it was definitely nothing like it is now even today. Then the following year they brought it, he was challenged again to come up with another type of a dream cask, and a cask referring to a barrel of whiskey. Yeah, so the PX that Sergio has behind him, and that was a 20-year-old PX. So 20 being the youngest whiskey in there, and PX referring to another type of grape, as opposed to Palomino Fino, which is in Oloroso, Palomino Fino is in Oloroso, in Manzanilla and Fino and all that. But PX is Pedro Jimenez. It's just another style of grape, very sweet, very rich, matures on the vine. And Billy really loved this sort of flavor and decided it would work really well with his whiskey. And then this year, again, they were challenged with coming up with another dream cask, and they decided this year they would look at, well, they had a 27-year-old Ruby Port, and which was launched back before lockdown, and they had decided that they would use another fortified wine, because that's what Redbreast is all about, this fortified wine influence, and they went for a Ruby Port cask. Now, just to say straight off, the 27-year-old is immaculate, polished. It is balanced. It is beautiful. This is an amazing whiskey too, in my opinion, this 28-year-old port. But the difference between this and the 27-year-old is this is two-thirds fortified wine. Look at that color.
No, the color is the first thing that stands out.
So
unbelievable.
The 27-year-old is super balanced, but it has influence from bourbon barrels, from sherry butts, but this is a really, the fortified wine is by far the dominant flavor profile in here, and that's the European oak, but also the port and the sherry influence on this whiskey. So they're not the same whiskey. This is not the 27-year-old a year older. This is a different whiskey, different production story, and quite a complex one at that. It's also that cask strength, lads, and ladies, of course, and basically it's 28 years of age is the youngest whiskey in here, and it's 51.5% ABV. And look, it initially went on sale at €490, but like all these dream casks, this sold out. Last year we had unprecedented demand that really, excited us, but it was really quite overwhelming. So this year they went for a ballot method to make it a little more fair, and they really went out of the way to try and make it as fair as possible, and we'll even try to do that again next year. There was 912 bottles that came out of this bottling, but a 22 of those went in to send it out to influencers and bloggers, and basically people that would write about the whiskey and encourage people to to get more into the whiskey. So just to say to you, the age range of the whiskey is about 28 to 31 years of age. You have 4 different casks that are giving influence here. So if you bear with me for a minute, would I be allowed to go through the production story, or is it a bit too much?
It's far too complex for me to remember, so you fire away.
Fire away. Okay, so
You've made me
look.
cry.
Make you cry. Okay. So 4 casks. Okay, one is a single pot still. That was distilled in 1989. It was then matured in an ex-bourbon barrel and then recast into that ruby port cask in 1995. So it spent, the guts of 6 years in an ex-bourbon barrel, and then first fill bourbon, and then into a ruby port cask from 1995 until it was essentially bottled in 2020. So it is not a finish by any stretch of the imagination. How many years is that? Oh my God, that's terrible. Is it 25 years in a ruby?
Yeah, and not to be overpowered is amazing.
Yeah, it's incredible. So, and then the second cask, okay, is a single pot still as well. This whiskey, I should say, contains all of the pot still styles that we produce in Middleton. So you have all the different pot still styles in here. This was distilled in 1991, the second cask, and it is full maturation in the second fill bourbon until it was, so it's 28 years in the next bourbon barrel. Then you have a different pot still type, single pot still, which was distilled in 1991 and matured also in a second fill bourbon barrel for full maturation for those 28 years. And the 4 cask type is another single pot still, distilled in 1991, aged in a ex-bourbon barrel until 2011, and then recast for 9 years in a sherry butt. But then here's the kicker. They're all recast back into cask number 1, which was the ruby port cask.
Yeah.
So all of those, and then they marry in there for 15 weeks, and then you get the final whiskey. Yeah. So I know it's a little bit kind of all over the kind of complicated and stuff, but it just shows you the complexity of it and how different it is. But then, Chris, if you want to jump in there and talk about just the color and the nose on it and that sort of thing, about how rich it is, and
well, just to touch on the blending of it. So the core range itself, as Sergius was saying earlier on year, there's small increments of differences you can pick out in the cask strengths, but for a brand that's talking couple hundred casks, and we can say that there's 200 liters in a bourbon cask, 500 liters in a port or a sherry cask, but once you take away the angel share, every single cask sitting side by side, 180 something, 190 something, they're all completely different. So for a blender to work with literally thousands of liters to get a pretty much consistency throughout the whole with small little iterations, with this, like, absolutely outstanding. And I do like the choice of 4 different distillates, as old as they are, the quality of the casks and everything. You can tell that they're brilliant, but the kicker at the end to recast them back into the fortified wine casks, to let them marry, to let them soak it back up, and then to control all 4 of them so you don't have one dominating flavor. Absolutely fantastic. The color is phenomenal. It's one thing when you have a 500 or 700 ml bottle and you look at an incredible color. By the time you put a small dram into a glass, usually it doesn't live up to the color that's in a massive concentrated bottle. With this, side by side, really, really dark, almost or a little bit darker than mahogany, real good ruby tint to it. And then the port itself completely characterized, like completely comes across. Like it's oily and it's viscous, but it's light enough that when it does coat your palate, you do get room for fruit, you do get room for spice, and you do get room for everything to kind of come across itself. It's not one dominating factor, one layer on one layer, everything's intermingled. You definitely drop that down to the fact that it has that recasking and marriage at the end.
And is that what's making this so incredibly easy to drink? I mean, this does not go at its. This does not drink at its calf strength. This
Like
seems easier to drink than actually the 15-year-old.
Well, as you said, at 51.5 is, even though it's only 5.5% higher than the 15-year-old, the angel share will bring the percentages down and down and down. But the fortified casks themselves, they add enough sweetness, they add enough complexity to it to balance it out. And the fact that you're bringing a bourbon and a sherry and the port together, you don't have a dominating port influence, you don't have a dominating sherry influence or bourbon. They're working in harmony with one another. You can definitely tell that this has been in port, but there's enough sherry there to carry across heavy fruits and light fruits. There's enough bourbon there to carry across the vanilla sweetness and the light kind of peppered spice that you would expect from a Redbreast. Just fantastic.
I mean, even the notion of mixing port and sherry, as constituent parts is something that I don't know if it's been done before. There aren't many examples, certainly, of whiskey being finished in both. I'm sure this happened accidentally, but no, the balance is neither one nor the other overpower. I mean, the port is a little bit more to the front.
Yeah, the closest kind of DNA structure to this you could probably find would be the Bushmill 16-year-old when it comes to something being in sherry and something being port, but that's not ruby port, it's a different type. And this has one distillate that spent many, many, many years in port before it gets the recask and gets the kind of marriage together. But there's enough of a sherry influence in, obviously it's pot still versus malt, but there's enough of a sherry influence in this to completely take it to the side. There's enough of a bourbon influence to take it to the side. But the ruby port itself, which is kind of a classification, which is quite funny. Some parts will do a ruby port finish that will, or ruby port that will be a year old, some 3 years old, some 5 years old. This one, definitely, the influence there is powerful and really good.
That's amazing. But I mean, you still do get the wood hasn't lost either.
No.
Every component is active there, and they don't clash with each other either, which is what is amazing.
Like, if you could taste the 4 different casks side by side before you taste this, it would probably tell us a lot more about it. But I would personally put down that balance of wood to the recasking at the very, very end. It will let everything marry together. It will let everything re-soak in. And I know 15 weeks is a short period of time for
28-year-old whiskey.
Yes, but for fatting anything from a Jameson blend the whole way up to 27, 28-year-old, the time in which it sits in a vat, be it a stainless steel or wooden, that is the difference between your balance and one flavor spiking. And with this, even though it is quite wooded in a very, very good way, it's a balance of wood, it's a balance of sweet, it's a balance of fruit.
So there is trad pop in this chair as well, is there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it comes across.
Yeah, there is, and so you get that exotic fruit type note to it, which is for me kind of a real signature of it. But like there's just layers of complexity that Chris was talking about there. Like it's like a dessert, it's like real plumminess from the port, and you get chocolate notes and cinnamon. Like it's just layers of ripe fruits, and I mean, but there's all those raisins and sultanas that you're very familiar with in Redbreast. Like it's distinctly a Redbreast whiskey, but my goodness, you're getting just such value, if you want to call it, from the fortified wine. Like it's absolutely, it's beautiful.
Those sultana notes, they just, particularly for me, especially my granny used to grow sultana or create sultanas in Greece. So that note comes back.
Showing up.
Really resonates.
You're showing off now.
Oh, I wish, for sure. Look, that's a fantastic whiskey. I think, I don't want to pick a favorite out of all of them yet, but it does stand out. Do we want to go on the? Oh, sorry. One question I did have is, the Dreamcast program is set to continue for next year.
Yeah, I think it has been really, been popular and successful, and there's great passion for it in Middleton. like obviously the Redbreast team and Billy Lighton, who's synonymous with Redbreast, and of course Dave McCabe, our other blender. Yeah, they're working on it at the moment. I believe they're working on our next. What will it be? I find it really amazing that they are able to be so creative, and how it's just such a complex and interesting thing. I find it really interesting the way they're able to come up with these ideas to create these dream casks, and they really are. They're unbelievably good. They're just so good. Yeah.
That's one of the things about the program itself. Personally, I don't actually mind about the age statement that's on it, from the 32-year-old to the 20 to the 28, because you're focusing on something completely and utterly different every single time. You're focusing on different types of fortified wines, or the distillate types themselves, or the amalgamation. Like each one that's been released, the three of them are very, very different, but they do focus on something that is really unique, and it just showed Warehouse itself. If you were to creep in something along the lines of Marsala, Madeira, all different types of fortified wines over the years, whether you're dropping it to 15, increasing it to almost your Silent Distillery, 40-odd-year-old, they're just a way of a consumer looking into the warehouse without actually physically being there. And when it comes to the Ruby Port, absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, and of course, it's a great way of introducing port and sherry to somebody that might not be familiar with them as well. So, there are people that just drink whiskey.
Yeah.
So, and we need the sherry industry to continue to do well, because we need their casks. Is that right, Jer?
Sorry, you broke up there. I don't know what was that?
I was just commenting that we need people to continue to drink sherry and port so that we have great casks for whiskey.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, you think about something like you don't have to drink Oloroso. You don't. There's loads of different types of sherry, and wine merchants like people like Mitchell's, who are the agents for Lestau. They have an amazing range there. They have vermouths, which are beautiful, just over ice with a twist of orange. They have you go to someone like people, O'Brien's, or you go to any of the specialist off licenses, McCambridge's in Galway, or you think of the Celtic Whiskey Shop in Dublin. They have great sherry selections and great port selections, and they'll be able to guide you through it. And they're available in all the supermarkets as well. Or pick up something like a Fino or a Manzanilla sherry and have it with some seafood, have it chilled. It's a really pleasant drink, And I think
while you mentioned the distilleries, the off licenses, if we can, everybody, if we can support your local off license as well, the small independent retailer, we know they're going through difficult times. So if we can support them as well, obviously the bigger chains are doing very well, but the likes of our small independents that are offering us the variety, I think it's important we can support them. So drink lots of sherry, whiskey, and port. And obviously, Jared's just announced that the next Dreamcast has a vermouth finish. I don't think he's giving anything away, unfortunately. No.
Now, when it comes down to it, if you're going to take anything away from this, start cooking as many paellas as you can and start using sherry to cook it off. One of the best things you can do when it comes to learning tasting notes, experience everything yourself. If you're going to drink something with a sherry influence, drink a Fino and a Amontillado and Oloroso and a Pedro Jimenez to learn the differences between them. Your Ruby Ports, your Tawny Ports, your LBVs. If you genuinely drink them on their own, whether it's side by side or just side by side with one of your favorite whiskeys that has that influence, it's one of the best ways to actually realize the difference between your all bourbon malt and your all bourbon malt with a port finish, or your different types of pot stills, and the reason why a Redbreast is the way it is when it comes to bourbons and sherries. And definitely with this Ruby Port finish, we sat down in the bar, we drank a good bit of Ruby Port and Tawny Port side by side with a couple of different whiskies to figure out why you get the flavors you do, where they are coming from, and is that fruit impact from the distillate, is that fruit impact from the wood, or literally a combination of the both. And in doing that, you buy in from your local off licenses, and hey, and then Jer will sell them single casks and we get even more treats.
But I mean, the other side of it is, you know, you can't pigeonhole sherry into just being sherry either,
Yeah.
or porter. I don't think they quite have the range that whiskey has, maybe, but it's not far off it, probably, Chris, is it?
No, like when you sit down and you say the word Oloroso, for instance, which we will attribute to a lot of the Redbreast range, Oloroso itself will have sec, which is sweet, demi-sec, which is kind of semi-sweet and dry. From that Oloroso range itself, it can depend on the length of time it's sitting in the wood, how much oxidization it's left to. You can do the same with Finos and Amontillados. If you have 7 different brands side by side, they're the same grape, same style, done in the same way, but you will have little iterations. The same way you'll have 10 different malts or 10 different pot stills side by side, you will end up with different flavor profiles side by side. But when it comes to sherries and ports, the length of time in the wood, the length of time of fermentation, everything will be that little bit different. And then it just comes down to the vatins themselves, just like whiskey with the blenders.
Excellent. Okay, so let's get on to number 12, which I have to commend Chris on his strength on tightening the tops of these bottles. Either that or I'm getting drunk, but they're not the easiest, though. So at least you got them all in one piece.
When we have 3 in the States, we have 2 in the UK and 24 in Ireland drinking at the moment, then myself, yourself. Omar sadly is sitting in a meeting and not sitting here.
Yeah, so apologies
Omar.
everybody from Omar Fitzell of Last Dram Good and the Talk Dram tweet tasting was meant to be with us today.
He
Unfortunately,
was
work out of the way.
yeah. He was saying that be it tomorrow or over the next couple of weeks, he's going to sit down to all 6 over a Friday night dram, Saturday night sip, or a Sunday night sup, and walk you through his own tasting notes and his own experience, and rewatch the video and have to sit through us. But he sends his apologies and hopes everyone's keeping well.
Excellent. Okay, well, look, we wish him well. Let's move on to the final one, which is Chris.
This is the last release of the Redbreast cask strength, the B219. One of the reasons for choosing a cask strength in the lineup is it's showcasing where Redbreast went in 2011, deciding to change the ways a little bit and showcase a cask strength whiskey, showcase what Redbreast is like for the blenders themselves when they're choosing the casks before everything is dropped. So usually for a cask strength whiskey, it's a vatting of many different styles or many different casks, and this is what the blenders themselves will actually taste before they decide to drop the ABVs down for bottling strength or for different commercial markets. It's also a nod back to the 1950s and below for when you would get casks being handed from Jameson or John Jameson and Sons over to Gilbey's themselves, and they would have been handed them a cask strength as a full cask or whatever the Angel Share will kind of allow, and it was their choosing to bring the ABV down or sell as is. And the same with the bonders and merchants around Ireland and the UK. They would be handed the casks at cask strength, and it would be up to them to bottle it. So for this is a good treat, and if anyone is on Twitter, Dave Amara probably has to have a shout out. He's the most vocal person when it comes to cask strength whiskies, especially in the last cask strength crusade kind of rebellion. But it does help and it does show. Cask strength in Ireland specifically is a very hard thing to do because our VAT is and our duty is very, very high. If you go outside of the country, you can probably get a cask strength bottle for the same price we would pay for a normal one. That's a topic for a different day. But cask strength for any new brand coming out, fair play to anyone doing it. It is a risk. Redbreast obviously is a fantastic brand with a very, very good representation and reputation. This is your regular 12-year-old at 55.8%. So good jump up in spice, good jump up in fruit, and a powerful enough nose. And when it comes to the blenders themselves, they're giving you the option to drink it as they drink it, to bring it down slightly in ABV to closer to bottling strength, or even bring it down further. Every single time you see a tasting note on the back of a bottle, that is cask strength brought down to 20-odd%, and they taste it to every single increment on the way down. So if it says that it has a cotton candy sweetness, that might be at 28.6. If it says it has a certain amount of fruit, that could be at the high 50s. So every time you read a tasting note, when you add water to this, you are now experiencing what a blender will experiencing. You're now experiencing back in the 40s and 50s what Gilbey's technically would be experiencing, something that's unadulterated and untampered, so to speak. And
Yeah, it's
something that is unbelievably alive.
Yeah, no, this is wonderful stuff, and I have to say, it is quite different from some of the other Redbreast 12 cast strengths that I've had over the years.
One of the fun things about last year is it's the first year that they released 2 in a year. Now,
Yes, 2 batches.
Sure might be able to touch on this. I'm not 100% sure if it was a labeling decision or a demand decision that they split it in half, so to speak. But from 2011 to 2013, and then from 15 to 18, everything was done once. I know 14 was the South American and American market that they kind of split it, but Ireland has only ever got 1 a year, and last year was the difference. And a holy grail, to be honest, because B1 and B2 side by side, they're very similar in DNA, but they are quite different. You can pick out different spices in both. You can pick out different fruit in both. You can still tell it's the same style of whiskey and same style of brand. But for me personally, the B116 is the one I will always hunt down and search for. And then the B219 is my favorite of the two, hence me picking this one.
So the reason, Chris, is that the first batch of casks was about 28 barrels of whiskey in 2011. And as demand increased, they increased the number of the casks in each vatting. And then it got to the point that last year, it's about just under 100 casks of whiskey. And basically what they did was they did 2 separate vattings. So that's why it got to that. The demand has built up. And previously, they would just do another batch when, basically it ran out. So they go, we need more cask strength, and then the blenders would essentially create another batch of cask strength Redbreast. But they would develop it and tweak it all the time. And in parallel with the same way that Redbreast has evolved to become, in my opinion, I think it's the best batch ever was the last couple of bottlings of Redbreast. It's just got so good, and I suppose the cask strength in parallel, it is now there's just much more demand for it, Chris, and that's why they did two bottlings last year. It's everything.
Whiskey, yeah.
It's everything you love in Redbreast, but it is concentrated. So there's more spice, there's more fruit, there's more alcohol, there's more mouthfeel. It's oilier, it's creamier, it's spicier. It's just an incredibly good whiskey.
Well, what's the future for these? Obviously, there's been a rebranding, and I'll share the rebranding. Obviously, everybody has seen the rebranding, but just for those that perhaps haven't, there is a rebranding that happened. What was the reasoning for that? Ger?
Evolution as opposed to revolution. It's just that the brand has got to a point now where it just needed this evolution. So it needed to, create more distinct identity around each of the members of the Redbreast family. So, for example, you look at the cask strength now, it no longer is the same label as the 12-year-old. The 12-year-old had, you can see it says 12 years of age underneath the label, but it doesn't look like it's a different color capsule closure up here, which used to be identical to the 12-year-old, which is on the left of people's screen there. And what was happening was in bars, for example, bartenders were picking up the 12-year-old cask strength and serving it accidentally instead of the 12-year-old. So Brilliant. They wanted to create unique. Yeah, great for you, absolutely. Not great for the bar owner, but so you can see.
I can attest to many months of stock takes and the style of lighting that we have in the Dillon. Yep.
Yeah.
completely.
Yeah, it's dark in there, all right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you see the customer smiling too much, you know it's happened. Or their breath has been taken away because they didn't realize what was about to happen.
I
So
remember.
it was also to give the bird more of prominence. So
Yeah.
you feel, you know, the 15-year-old Le Maison de whiskey bottling, you'll notice it isn't. There's no bird on the bottle. It's actually a kind of a like antique image of a pot still. So first thing they did about 5 years ago was put a bird on the label,
Yeah.
the redbreast bird, and now the bird is in flight. So it's in a on a 12-year-old, it's in a stationary position, and then it's in different stages of flight across the range as well. And
Yeah.
it's not just age that differentiate them. You know, you'll know that different production techniques have led to unique characteristics to each member of the family. And so that's the reason behind the it's not a rebranding, it's just an evolution of packaging. The whiskey, it's the same great whiskey. And in fact, it's just, you know, they're always looking at the whiskey and trying to tweak it slightly based on what people liked and they don't like. You know, Billy Lighton and Dave McCabe are always listening to people's um, commentary about different whiskies that they produce. So they're not, you know, they're not just sitting in a room and looking at each other. They really do listen to what people say about the cask strength, about 15-year-old, about any of the whiskies that are produced. So hopefully that explains it. But
Yeah.
you know, Redbreast 12-year-old is just essentially, my goodness, it's 12-year-old but on steroids almost. Like it's
Yeah. Chris, do you want to give us your tasting notes on this particular one then? And
On this particular one, I found the bourbon influence actually quite prominent. That kind of bit of vanilla, kind of dusty wood, dryness, kind of to the front, and then kind of towards the back and the sides of the mouth. That kind of almost pungent fruit sweetness kind of coming up and jumping. Absolutely beautiful. But in the middle of your tongue is where that kind of woodness or sweet kind of vanilla and woodness is coming forward. Back of your tongue, that fruitiness is coming. When it meets in the middle, it really does create like a harmony. And give it another 5 or 10 seconds, the harmony kind of evolves. You get saliva glands going absolutely nuts, and you get a good bit of pot still spice from underneath. But the regular 12 is more kind of crackback pepper. With this, it'd be more kind of green pepper and or pink peppercorns, that kind of fruity spice like popping up. It's absolutely beautiful. But yeah, and just
it delivers for a long time as well. This is a long finish on this.
Oh yeah.
And actually, certainly in the price category, it probably is the whiskey with the longest finish.
For the price,
I'm trying to think,
certainly.
You know, even, you know, I often get asked about comparing this with John's Lane. The finish on this is longer for me.
Yeah, those that were privileged enough to sit the Belfast Whiskey Week and try the John's Lane at cask strength, the absolutely fantastic, but insane that the 12-year-old cask strength for a majority of the years the finish has been longer. The John's Lane, it more ramped up the spice and more ramped up that kind of date and apricot kind of dried fruit notes, but the finish is certainly more overwhelming with this. It goes on for days, especially if you talk as much as we do. It just does not stop.
So Jared, this is €79, is
it? Yeah, as far as I know, it is. No, it's more expensive than that, isn't it? 89. Yeah, it is. 89. It's not. Yeah, sounded a bit, just a little bit off there. Yeah, it's. I think it's great value for the price of it. I mean, it's.
If we had less duty, it'd be great.
You obviously had the €10 voucher from Dunn's.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's not enough. But look, I mean, they've been all fantastic whiskeys. You know, it's hard not to get sentimental about finding some of the older ones. You know, the fact that the 50 and the 60 actually kept so much of their flavor profile is phenomenal. You know, they're like they were brand new. So Chris, well done on sourcing some fantastic liquid.
Thank you very much.
Well done on creating.
Thank you, Chris.
Fantastic tasting to bring it through this range and raising money for great charities, and we're giving this all an exceptional experience. I mean, these are, once in a lifetime experiences in a lot of cases, So.
That's one of the bits of fun about doing something like this. Over time, some people are lucky enough, you will come across eventually, depending on the bar, the auction house, whatever, you will come across the 60s, the 70s and 80s and 90s. You might get to experience them, but when you have them side by side, it creates a new story in itself. And this is the fourth time we've done this with different brands. We've stepped on Powers, Tullamore Dew, Bushmills, a couple Scottish, and this for the 4 different Irish. And this, thankfully, and someone said a prayer somewhere, has lived up to the fact that the levels are high. There's been basically no oxidization, and especially with the 60s and the 70s, they almost taste as if someone bottled them yesterday. Granted, the casks are a lot older, but it lives up to the ABV. It lives up to the level itself.
Vibrant. I found them to be all vibrant and lively. There was no dullness, there was no oxidation. I just, thought it was incredible. So, and of course, we need to thank Jared as well for not wearing his white shirt, which was commented on.
Not wearing my white shirt.
I think it was Rowan maybe commented on that. But thank you to everybody that's joined us from all over the place. So I know it's still early in the US, so enjoy your lunch. You can take
I hope I made people cry.
Thank you very much, Chris and Ger, for being fantastic hosts. I respect them so much. I mean, they're two incredibly modest guys that don't, take the praise that they should. They are the backbone of this Irish whiskey industry, and for the whiskey enthusiasts, this is what we really love. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you all for joining, for helping the charities, for sharing your thoughts, and look forward to seeing you again. If you have enjoyed the show, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel or give our website a go, irishwhiskeymagazine.com, and see if you like any features there and may consider subscribing as well. And I feel really privileged to have been part of this. Thank you very much. Have a safe evening, and sláinte, everybody. So
Sláinte.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
From ourselves and from Omar.
Cheers, Omar.
Somewhere.
Thank you.